Okay, so an extended text this morning and a challenging one to boot, but I kind of want to just start this off with a little bit of a question this morning. Can a follower of Christ become so conformed to the world that he is no longer recognizable? Can a follower of Christ become so conformed to the world or so worldly that no longer do people recognize him? I think this text is pointing to a yes answer to that question. We've dealt with Lot a couple of times before, and we're going to deal with him again today, specifically in this context of worldliness. Sometimes believers, those who come to know the Lord, those who are genuinely saved, become so worldly and so callous that they become unrecognizable. We're going to see that, how Lot was not recognized for his spirituality from the people of Sodom. He was not even recognized for his spirituality by his own family. And that's evidenced in the way and the behavior that his daughters undertook near the end of this story. And so he's a man who's become so worldly that he's not really set apart any longer. He can't be identified as anything different than the world. And so this text indicates to us that worldliness is a problem that affects even God's people. Oftentimes we think of worldliness as only being something that applies to lost people. But the Bible is clear that the temptations for us are many. They are often, they are frequent, and we can often be tempted toward or back toward worldliness even though we have been set apart. Lot had become so worldly that no one even recognized him anymore. And we'll see here that this conformity to the world is going to cost Lot everything. It's going to cost him his family, it's going to cost him his possessions that he worked so hard to pursue, and we'll deal with that in a moment too. You remember how Lot looked and he saw that the valley was well watered. And the things there were to be desired. And that passage concluded by saying, and Lot went and pitched his tent over against Sodom. And we saw the beginning of Lot's failures. This morning we see the conclusion of Lot's failures and the mark that he would leave on history. And so we talked about how last week Abraham interceded for the people in the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. How Abraham basically bartered with the Lord. Lord, if you can find 50 righteous there, would you spare the city? Or how about 45? Or maybe 40, 30, 20? Lord, surely if you find 10, you would spare the city for the sake of the righteous. And the text is going to record for us today that the reason that Lot was spared was because of Abraham's intercession. Otherwise, he would have been swept away with the judgment that God brought on those wicked cities. And so we're going to see today that when God's justice comes to the world, the worldly in it will reap those consequences. God's justice, God's judgment is always coming, and those who are worldly will reap the consequences along with them. So the question becomes, how can we avoid falling into the same temptations that Lot did? How do we deal with those? How do we overcome these temptations to become worldly in a world that is so appealing oftentimes? Why did Lot depart from Abraham and go his own way? He was in pursuit of riches. By the time we find him in Sodom, he's sitting in the gate of the city, indicating that he had become probably a high leader within the city government of Sodom. How do we avoid those temptations in our life to pursue possessions and power and prestige and all of those other rotten P words, right? How do we avoid those things in our own life? I think this text is given to us for those answers. Now, Genesis 19 sets us up with a third contrast between Abraham and Lot. We've seen him twice before. Both times, Lot ends up coming out in a negative context, whereas Abraham comes out with a positive look. Abraham followed the Lord and he glorified God in all that he did. But Lot departed from the Lord. He went away from Abraham and ultimately reaped the consequences of that. Quite destructive consequences. In our narrative here, Abraham has met the Lord and the two angels who are on their way to destroy Sodom. And you'll remember that he stops them, invites them in, he prepares them a feast, and for all of his trouble, he receives a promise. But you'll notice that that's not the same situation with Lot. Lot invites them in, but what does he receive? Consequences and ultimately destruction. Abraham has invited the angels in, he's blessed them. He was invited to be an intercessor for the people in the city of Sodom. And it's the fact that he interceded that is the central fact or the central idea of our text today. It is the intercession of one on behalf of another. We'll see the grace that God shows toward the one that delivers the other. And you can kind of already see where that's going, can't you? Because there's grace that is shown to us, not because of us, not on our behalf, but because of Christ. Abraham is a prototype. He is a type of Christ. He pictures the ministry that Jesus would have that we are living the benefits of today. Now, we talked about this judgment of God last week. We talked about how Abraham's invitation to be an intercessor was kind of striking a balance between the two. Justice was coming to Sodom because of their wickedness, but Abraham is the intercessor who sees to it that these people end up being delivered. Now, Sodom is going to be judged, and it's worthy of its own destruction. We're going to talk about the heinous sin of Sodom here in just a moment. And these Sodomites were guilty of plenty of it. Justice was to come, but God also shows mercy to his people. He delivers them through the judgment. He takes them out of it. And that's a beautiful promise that I think extends to us as well, that in Christ, judgment is coming to this world one day, but in Christ we will be delivered through it. We won't receive the judgment that the world does because we have repented of our sin and trusted in Christ for salvation. And so Abraham and Lot then become textbook examples of what to and what not to be. We should look to the example of Abraham as a positive one. While Lot will be recorded as a righteous man, his example is certainly not one that we should emulate. And so today we're going to examine how conformity with the world carries consequences for the future. Let's look at the first part of this, conformity with the world. We're going to deal with that first because I think it's important to flesh that out for us as well. What does it look like to be conformed to the world? Perhaps you're sitting there thinking, do I need to do a little self-evaluation today? Am I a worldly Christian? Well, hopefully some of the things that we see here in Lot's life will be a guide to us as well. Now, as is often the case, we recognize that it's usually not the righteous who have an influence on the unrighteous, but it's often the other way around, isn't it? There's a reason that Paul told the Corinthians not to be unequally yoked with anyone. Why? Because they will draw you away from the Lord. There couldn't be a greater example than Lot in Sodom. He moves near a city. He eventually moves into a city. He becomes a leader in the city, and now he's going to reap destructive consequences because of these choices. He became unequally yoked with a wicked generation that ultimately the Lord was going to destroy. And so the outcry against Sodom has gone up to the Lord, and he has now come to execute judgment. The outcry, he says, has, and we saw in our text last week, had risen all the way to heaven. The Lord had heard about the outcry of the sin and the wickedness that had taken over this city. And so I think primarily or initially that necessitates we ask a question. What's the sin of Sodom? What is the sin? What is the reason that God has come to judge? Well, how much time do you have? Because it's not just one, is it? There's pride, there's prejudice, there's homosexuality, there's rape, there's incest, there's violence, there's murder, and on and on and on and on and on. This city had become so depraved, so fallen, that they had been given up by the Lord to a debased mind and to practice those things which ought not be done, and they had plowed headlong into them. They had not only slipped into sin, they had dove into it head first. This city was sinful above so many others. Now, any one of these sins would have been worthy of the judgment of God. The Bible tells us that. It's not a multitude of sins or how grave the sin may be that separates us from God and eventually sends us to a place called hell. Even one sin is sufficient. And Sodom had plenty of it. Any one of those sins I just enumerated would have been sufficient to bring God's judgment. But the prevalence of all of them collectively together, that increases the tension in our narrative, doesn't it? They weren't just given over to one sin or two sins or three. It's a multitude of sins, of abominations before the Lord. And so then when you think about this, when you read this text, it becomes reminiscent of another period in history, doesn't it? You remember these words from Genesis 6:5? The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And then the flood came and swept them all away. It seems that Sodom is kind of a microcosm of that earlier judgment that came through the flood. Everything they did was bent toward depravity and wickedness. And God has now come to judge. Through Abraham's intercession, God had promised to spare the righteous living there, and Lot is the beneficiary of that. Had it not been for Abraham's intercession, Lot would have been swept away with all of them through sulfur and brimstone and all of that stuff. But we need to think about who Lot is. We've encountered him before. Can you recall any instances where he was presented in a positive light? Was there ever any instance in Genesis where it said maybe we should be like Lot or emulate his example? No, he's given as a negative example or as a counterexample. This study that we're doing here for the last several weeks and going forward is entitled Abraham, A Journey of Faith. Abraham is presented as the protagonist, and Lot is the antagonist. He's the negative example to Abraham's positive example. And the Bible's trying to hold that up because we have a choice to make often in life. Will we be like Abraham, who followed the Lord wholly and glorified the Lord, or will we be like Lot, who was bent by the ways of the world? And I think God gives us these stories so we can make these comparisons. Now, the question I had as I'm studying through this is, okay, Lord, why should I be so concerned with such a worldly man? Because the reason's really not in here in Genesis chapter 19. The reason we have to turn all the way to 2 Peter chapter 2 and find this out. This is why we should care. Peter wrote these words thousands of years after Lot lived. He said, if by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly. And get this, and if he rescued righteous Lot, greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked, for as that righteous man lived among them day after day, he was tormenting his righteous soul over their lawless deeds that he saw and heard. If God can rescue him, then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials. And Peter uses that as an encouragement to us that we will all endure trials, we will all endure tribulations and suffering, but God can get us out of it. God knows how to solve it. He was saying, take the example of Sodom and Gomorrah, that wicked place. Righteous Lot lived there, tormented and tortured and in trial and in tribulation as he suffered through the lawless deeds that they were committing all around him. And so the Bible then records Lot as being a righteous man, although a very bad example. And so sometimes I think there's a tendency to think, and this is probably a good thing, that even though I do bad things as a believer, God still loves me and I am still saved. But it should never be used as an excuse to live like a worldly person. That's the picture that the Bible presents of Lot and every worldly believer. One sin doesn't take us out of salvation, right? We said that in Jonah chapter 2. Salvation is the Lord. It's not mine, it's His. One sin doesn't take us out. Two sins doesn't take us out. But it certainly produces consequences in our lives. And so Lot then becomes the prime example of a worldly believer. And despite his deliverance, sometimes we have a tendency to see this, look at what Lot did and God saved him. That is never the attitude that we should undertake. Despite the deliverance of Lot, we should look at the consequences of his life and avoid his error of conformity with the world. That's the sum total of what's going on here. So, what I want to look at is 5 warning signs of worldly believers. This is kind of the self-evaluation thing I talked about a moment ago. Sorry for the long introduction, but it's a long text. So, 5 things very quickly. Number 1, worldly believers embody a fleshly focus. Worldly believers always embody a fleshly focus. We see in verse 1, the 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. Now notice the progression here in Lot's life. He was with Abraham, and the Lord was blessing them immensely. The Bible recorded for us that their flocks and herds had grown to be so great that they could no longer dwell together. And so Abraham comes self-sacrificially and says, Lot, we can't stay together anymore. There's not enough land. There's not enough water. Why don't you pick out the land you would like to have and go that way, and I will go the other. And as I said a moment ago, the Bible recorded for us that Lot looked upon the Jordan Valley and saw that it was well watered like the garden of the Lord, and he chose that land, and he went and pitched his tent as far as against Sodom. And so there's this progression where he leaves God's people, he gets out on his own. By the time we get to Genesis chapter, I think it was chapter 17, Lot is now living in Sodom. And by the time we get to chapter 19, basically Lot's running the place. Don't skip over what's going here. When it talks about he was sitting at the gate, that's communicating something very specific to us. It's foreign to us living in the 21st century in the West, but in the ancient Near Eastern culture, those who sat at the city gate were who? High government officials, tax collectors, people of influence, people of power, people of authority. That's who dwelt at the city gate. You would come up to the gates of Sodom and you'd want to enter the city, perhaps for trade or lodging or any number of things. What did you do there first? You'd pay a tax to come in. It was essentially a toll to come into the city, and you would agree to submit to the customs and the culture and the laws and the restrictions of said community. And so the fact that Lot is pictured as sitting in the gate indicates that he's not only living there, but he's essentially become like them. He's now part of Sodom. He not only lives there, he is complicit with it in all that it does. He left Abraham for the promise of riches. He went after the promise of riches, and he's found prosperity and power and position now in Sodom. His worldly dreams are being fulfilled. He's now living in a completely worldly way. And so a fleshly focus leads us away from God, and it opens us up to the possibility of consequences that befall the same worldly people among us. We may be saved through the fire, but it certainly won't be a blessing or a benefit. We may just get through by the skin of our teeth, but it won't be a blessing to us. And so worldly believers embody a fleshly focus. Secondly, worldly believers exhibit a flexible morality. This is probably one that we encounter quite often, I think. A selective or a flexible morality. In this situation, it's one thing, but over here with my other friends, compadres, or associates, it might be something far different. Worldly believers tend to be chameleons. They fit into every group. Rather than standing up for what they should, rather than leading with the Lord on their sleeve, rather than making their faith known, they tend to be chameleons and are comfortable operating in a number of different circles. That seems to be what's going on with Lot here. Peter said he's a righteous man who's tormented by the wicked deeds going on there, yet he's a part of them. He seems to fit right in. Notice here in the end of verse 1. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face to the earth. And he said, "My lords, please turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise up early and go on your way." And they said, "No, we're going to spend the night in the town square." But he pressed them strongly, knowing what would happen to them if they were unsheltered, so that they turned aside to him and entered his house. And he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. So notice here, Lot seems to be a good host. It's a parallel to what we saw with Abraham, right? The angels appear to Abraham, and what's the first thing Abraham does? Go kill the young calf, get 3 seahs of flour, and let's make cakes and bring out, basically the whipped cream and cherries. So they have this big feast. So we see here, well, Lot's kind of doing a similar thing. He's being a good host. He's being hospitable toward these visitors. But note the contrast with Abraham. They both shared a meal, but Abraham killed the young calf. He used fine flour. But notice here, Lot baked unleavened bread. You know what that is? Crackers. Abraham prepared a feast. Lot offered him a box of saltines. You kind of see the contrast there? Okay? So Lot insists the angels stay with him because of the danger. The angels emphatically resist, but ultimately they give in. And so we're left here initially in these first verses with a positive picture of Lot as host and as protector. And we kind of tend to think, well, okay, easy situations, easy to have good morals. This would be the right thing to do. But notice the text continues in verse 4. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man surrounded the house. And they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may know them." Lot went out to the men at the entrance, and he shut the door. So now we can see a tense encounter occurs in the text here. The men of the town, sinking ever deeper into their own depravity here, make an appeal to Lot. Bring these men out that we may know them. They want to know them. That's a biblical euphemism. You understand what that means, I'm going to assume. If not, ask me after class. But it's a biblical euphemism. Lot goes out. He goes out to meet them, and he makes here some appeals. He tries to dissuade them. He's trying to do the right thing, but look at where he ends up doing so. First, he preaches to them. He says, "I beg you, brothers, do not act so wickedly." And so he essentially appeals to morality here in the beginning. Don't do this dastardly deed. This is wickedness. Now, they wouldn't have seen it that way, but Lot thought so. But that doesn't work. It's to no avail. But notice here the next part. Notice flexible morality here in this appeal. He proffers a deal with him in verse 8. "Behold, I have 2 daughters who have not known any man. Let me bring them out to you and do to them as you please." So he's trying to do the right thing here. He's got visitors. They're from out of town, right? We've got visitors from out of town. He wants to make them a meal, which essentially becomes crackers. He tries to stave off the attack of the men of the city who want to do horrible things to them. But what does he do in order to protect them? But he offers his helpless, defenseless daughters in return. You see that flexible morality there? What's the deal? So strangers should be honored, but the family, sorry? What is the condition of Lot's morality here? It's a terrible example here of crisis management. It's exchanging a sin for a sin, as if one is greater or lesser than the other. And so this kind of gives us an indication then of Lot's moral character and how far from the influence of God he's actually come. Can you imagine a father offering his daughters to a band of marauders? No, we can't get our mind around that at all. But that's exactly what he does. He seems to pick and choose what is acceptable or what is moral in order to get himself out of a jam. Lot's morality is subjective here. Even in this situation, he has his best interests in mind. I have to confess, I sometimes glossed over this in previous studies of this text. He's thinking about himself here. How's it going to look if something bad happens to these visitors? How's it going to look if these strangers on the road are attacked? How's that going to look for me? What are people going to think of me? Now, a little bit of background helps. You need to understand that the Bible encourages from beginning to end to treat the stranger, the alien, or the visitor with respect, to treat them with honor, to protect them, to feed them, to clothe them, to whatever is necessary. The Bible encourages that from beginning to end. It's codified in the Mosaic Law. This story predates that a bit, but it's codified in the Mosaic Law. And so Lot has a proper focus in the beginning. He should protect the visitors, but look what he sacrifices in order to accomplish that. Do you think anybody in the town was going to care about his daughters? No. But were they going to care if the visitors were whatever? Yes. Lot is extremely concerned about how he is going to look in this situation. His morality is not only subjective, but it's flexible. And we see this played out generationally with his daughters that comes at the end of the text. Lot makes decisions based upon what's best for him. They do exactly the same thing. What was their concern? We need to have children. There's no man around, so we'll take matters into our own hands. They thought about what was best for them and acted wickedly, which is exactly what Lot does here. Compromising morality never solves a problem. Not one time. It just extends it or it delays it, and it creates a larger problem down the road each and every time. And notice here, then finally, he pleads with them. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof. There's the answer. How's this going to look? Don't do anything. They're under the shelter of my roof. If they were 2 doors down, I don't care. But right now, they're under my roof. And I don't want to look bad in this situation. So he pleads. His morality here is a convenient one. When it seems to benefit him personally, his morality is apparent. Don't do this dastardly thing. Do not do this wicked thing. When it doesn't, it becomes nearly invisible. It just tends to kind of disappear when it no longer serves his motives. His concern is not to honor God or protect his family. It's to protect his own reputation in town. That's where his focus is. Third, worldly believers exemplify a failed witness. Notice in verse 9. But they said, stand back. And they said, this fellow came to sojourn and he has become the judge. This guy who used to live afar off and moved into our town, who does he think he is? Now he thinks he can tell us what to do? Now we will deal worse with you than with them. Then they pressed hard against the man Lot and drew near to break down the door. But the men reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the entrance of the house, both small and great, so that they wore themselves out groping for the door. Don't gloss over that. I'm not going to deal with that extensively. The angels strike this bunch of depraved maniacs with blindness. Do they turn around and go home? They're still trying to get in. They still want to persist in their sin. They've been struck with blindness and they still want to proceed. That's who we're dealing with here. Verse 12, then the men said to Lot, have you anyone else here, sons-in-law, sons, daughters, or anyone you have in the city? Get them out of here, essentially. Verse 13, for we are about to destroy this place because the outcry against its people has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it. So Lot went out and said to his sons-in-law who were to marry his daughters, up, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city. But he seemed to his sons-in-law to be jesting. There's something interesting in that statement there. To his sons-in-law, he seemed to be jesting. Now notice here, the Sodomites don't respond to any of Lot's pleas at all. Why do you think that is? I think the answer is in the second part. The sons-in-law don't respond either. Do you think it's perhaps Lot doesn't live a life of faith? Lot hasn't made his faith known to his fellow city dwellers or even to his own family. It's as if the sons-in-laws are sitting around, what are you talking about, old man? We've never heard you talk this way before. Who is the Lord? And what is this judgment of which you speak? They thought Lot was joking. He was jesting. It indicates to me that Lot didn't live a life of faithfulness at all. He may have had some personal faithfulness, right? That faith in the heart or whatever it is. But he wasn't living it outwardly. It was something that was hidden from everyone, even his own family, even his own sons-in-law think he's joking. Perhaps Lot wasn't vocal with his faith and values. Perhaps he kept those to himself. Perhaps his witness was compromised. I think that might be another solution to this question. He might have been reluctant to be bold with his faith and values if he himself had compromised his witness in some way. The text doesn't seem to indicate that, so that's a little bit of conjecture, but I certainly think that we could see that in our own lives. Why are we often tempted to not lead with our faith and values in any given context? Sometimes, or at least part of the time, I think we may have compromised our witness. And more than anything, we fear the charge of hypocrite. And so I think Lot's values were probably correct, but his boldness about them was certainly not. The text says the people didn't respond because they thought he was joking. So this was apparently out of character for Lot. It was perhaps out of his normal life and attitude. It was certainly foreign to his sons-in-law. And I think the end of the story with the daughters kind of indicates it was maybe foreign with them as well. And so this is no powerful witness for God. Who is Lot? He's a carnal Christian. That's who he is. He may be righteous. He may have believed the Lord, but he's living a carnal lifestyle. And the Bible here is basically airing all of his dirty laundry as an example to us to not follow in his course. A carnal Christian who looks no different from the world is a failed witness. You'll never lead anybody to the Lord. You'll never disciple anybody if you're living carnally. We need to clean up our act, clean up our attitude, clean up our morality, and thereby polish the image of Christ that lives within us. And then fourth, worldly believers expose their own fragmented loyalty. Notice in verse 15, as morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, "Up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city." Notice the next verse, but he lingered. Put yourself in that place. Somebody comes here today and warns us, we're here to destroy this town. Get what is important to you and get out of here. Do you think you'd linger around here? I'd like to think I wouldn't. I'd like to think I'd say, yes, sir, on my way right now. But Lot lingered. Why? Do you think it's possible that he had such a love for his worldly lifestyle that he wasn't yet ready to give it up? Even under the threat of death, he wasn't really ready to give it up. That seems to be the indication for lingering. Facing certain death, Lot is still drawn by the allure of the city and its passions and its lusts and its riches. You got to imagine Lot's possibly looking at all of his stuff. Remember, he left Abraham to pursue riches. He's now gained those riches. You think he wanted to leave them behind? But my stuff's there. I've worked so hard for all of this. My people are there. They respect me. They know me. I have influence with them. You think he wanted to leave that all behind? I don't think so. I think he was so committed to his carnality, he wasn't willing to leave it behind, even under the threat of death. For Lot, his life had become inseparable from the world. You no longer could see daylight between them. He was of the world. That's the life that he lived. His identity was so wrapped up with the world, he couldn't imagine life without it. How do I live apart from all of this? This is who I am. But his identity should have been found in the Lord. That's what mattered. That's where his identity was. That's where his value was. That's where his influence, his importance, all of those other things that he was seeking in the world, that we often fall victim to as well, come not from the world, but they come from the Lord. The verse continues, so the men seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand. Don't miss that word seized. What's that indicating? He had to be drug out of town. He wouldn't go. They had to literally seize him and drag him away. That's how carnal he is by this point. The Lord being merciful to him. So the angels drag him out. Why? Because the Lord's merciful. The Lord knows better. He sends the angels to drag him out of there, to separate him from his worldliness. And they brought him out and they set him outside the city. They got to be taken by the hand to leave. They have to be led out. Lot's loyalty to God here is being quickly overcome by his devotion to his own carnality. Lot simply cannot bring himself to give up his carnal desires to follow God, even at the cost of his own life and his own family. Sound familiar? How many times have we heard the story of broken lives and broken families because of men and women who could not surrender their carnal lusts and carnal desires to the Lord, and instead persisted in them, wreaking havoc not only on their own lives, but on the lives of their families, and I would argue generations of their families afterward. This is nothing new. God has recorded it for us because he wants us to hold this text up to ourselves like a mirror and to look into it and to ask questions about our own lives. Are we living this way? Are we living worldly? Are we carnal Christians? Living with divided loyalties between life and the Lord never ends well, as evidenced by the end of this text. Number 5. Worldly believers express a fervent independence. I won't put myself under the authority of anyone, and I will not be told what to do. Verse 17, and as they brought them out, one said, escape for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. Escape to the hills, lest you be swept away. And Lot said to them, oh no, my lords. We're bringing judgment. It's on its way. Get out of here. Run for your life. No, wait a minute. You got time for a negotiation? I don't really want to go to the hills. Who wants to live in the hills? It's a long way away. I might not make it. How about I offer you a counter proposal? You get the gravity of what's going on here? Judgment is on its way in this moment, and Lot's negotiating. Because it's not what he wants to do. I will not be told what to do. I will have my way. Behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life. But I cannot escape to the hills, lest the disaster overtake me and I die. Now, so God's able to judge the city and to do all of these things, but he can't protect Lot in the sulfur storm. I don't know that that holds water. Verse 20, behold, this city is near enough to flee to, and it's a little one. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my life will be saved. And he said to him, behold, I grant you this favor also, that I will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken. Escape there quickly, for I can do nothing until you arrive there. So Lot continues to negotiate the terms despite his brush with death. He'd still like to have it his own way. He doesn't want to go to the mountains, but he's found another city. It's just a little one, but it's a more proper place for him. And that kind of brings us back to that old joke, right? Lord, I'll do anything, I'll go anywhere. Just please don't send me to Africa, right? That seems to be what Lot's doing here. Lord, I'll follow you. I'm going to leave. I'm going to do what you say, but I prefer to have it this way or that way. Let me just go to this city. I don't want to go out in the hills. There's hillbillies there. I want to go to this city. But it seems to me at least, perhaps there's an indication that Lot's not quite ready even yet to leave his carnal passions and desires. The city is where he can exercise these lusts and desires and passions, not in the hills. I want to stay close where there's opportunity and prosperity and life and so forth and so on. Lot's most likely looking for a way to remain close to his fleshly passions. Notice he says that phrase twice. It's just a little city. It's not a big heathen wicked city like Sodom. It's just a little city. But it's got some basic services and some opportunity there. Couldn't I just go there? The angels relent and they give in. And so we see here that facing death, he still refuses to submit. And the consequences to his worldliness are imminent. The warning signs are everywhere, and he's missing them. Is he alone in that? Do we sometimes miss the warning signs in our own lives? Those flashing yellow lights on the dashboard of life, do we sometimes miss those? We don't recognize our own worldliness, our own refusal to submit, our own refusal to obey. Obey. I don't think Lot's all that different from the rest of us sometimes. We have to recognize and resist our own temptations toward worldliness. Why? Because there's consequences for the future. You persist in that long enough, God is not just going to abide your worldliness. There will be consequences. Notice in verse 22, and this is going to be part 2 of our message here, consequences for our future. I promise it's far shorter than part 1. Verse 23, the sun had risen on the earth when Lot came to Zoar. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord of heaven. Judgment has arrived. Lot has escaped to the city. Judgment has come down. Sodom is a smoking heap. Judgment came. All was lost, though Lot himself was spared. What can we learn from his example? 4 quick things here. The first one, all we strive to gain, we will eventually lose. All we strive to gain, we will eventually lose. Verse 25, and he overthrew those cities and all the valley and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. It's total destruction, right? Why does he add, and what grew on the ground? He obliterated it. There is nothing left. Lot's home, Lot's possessions, Lot's house, all Lot's prosperity that he had worked so hard, pursued after. He even left Abraham to go and get it. It's all gone now. The Lord has wiped it away in a moment. Lot himself has been spared, but everything that he had has been lost. He'd spent his life pursuing the riches of the world, and it was all destroyed in an instant. How long do you think our stuff will remain around if the Lord sets his mind against it? Not long at all, huh? All we seek to gain in this life, we will eventually lose if it is not built on the Lord. God is going to destroy everything in this world one day. That's another thing that comes out of 2 Peter. One day the Lord is going to judge the world, but not by water this time, but by fire. He is going to cleanse the earth of everything that is here. He's going to take it all away. He's going to remake the entire world into the new heavens and new earth. And everything in the world and everyone in the world will perish with it. Lot should have sought the things of the Lord, but instead he went another way. Jesus said that we are to seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and then all this other stuff will be added to us. But Lot got it backwards. I want all the stuff first, Lord, and if that works out to my liking, then perhaps I'll seek after you and after your ways. Lot reversed the command of Jesus. And so all we strive to gain we will eventually lose. Number 2, looking back only accelerates our destruction. Verse 26, but Lot's wife behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. She looked back toward Sodom. She looked back toward everything they had. She looked back toward sin. She didn't want to leave home and her stuff and her city and her friends and all of these things. She looked back. But if Sodom biblically is a picture of sin, that's what she's looking toward. She's just been delivered from judgment, yet she turns and looks back. The indication here is it's a longing, it's a wanting, it's a desire. She didn't want it destroyed. She didn't want judgment to come. She was comfortable right where she was. And so she looks back. Notice the even sadder end of the story here. The worldly focus of Lot has rubbed off on his daughters as well. Verse 31, and the firstborn said to the younger, our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to come into us after the manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve offspring from our father. Thus both the daughters of Lot became pregnant by their father, in verse 36. So the same father who offered his daughters to a gang of rapists has now become the victim himself. Conformity with the world leads to generational sin. It doesn't just affect me. It affects children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. God said in the Old Testament that I am a God who visits the iniquity of the fathers to the 3rd and 4th generation. What does he mean by that? Does he mean that he's punishing the 4th generation because great-great-great-grandpa was bad? No. He means that generational sin is real. When fathers don't follow the Lord, sin persists from the next generation to the next generation to the next generation, and they reap the consequences of that. Lot's wife looked back. The daughters fell into this generational sin. Notice here in verse, let's see, where are we at? I'm not there yet. So these 2 daughters, desiring to preserve their family line, are desiring to have something better, worldly speaking, commit a heinous sin. Remember the story of Lot? He looked and saw that the valley was well watered and it was going to be prosperous. The daughters were thinking about themselves as well. We need a family line. Let us undertake this dastardly deed in order to preserve our family line. Lot did what was right in his own eyes, and so did his children. And that's the exact same thing that we see replicated in our own day today. parents who do not know the Lord and persist in heinous sin, or even believers who, be closer to this story, who are living in a worldly fashion, they pass those things on to their children, and they become carnal Christians. And they become carnal Christians. And they become carnal Christians. And so forth and so on down the line. Their sin will be perpetuated down through the generations of Lot. Notice the end of the text there. Who are these children to become? Moab and Ammon. Perpetual enemies of the nation Israel. Abraham is the father of Israel. But the descendants of Lot will be their perpetual enemies until God eventually reconciles them in the story of Ruth. One day we'll get to the story of Ruth the Moabitess, but at least in this point in the story, they're going to be sworn enemies of the nation Israel. How well did this sin turn out for them? How well did their desire to preserve their family line turn out for them? How well did their compromise on morality and what was right turn out for them? Not well at all. Our sin doesn't stop with us. It never does. We try and convince ourselves of that. I'm not hurting anybody but me. Sin impacts everyone around you every single time. It trickles down through the generations of those who come after us, wreaking terrible havoc. As a pastor, I have those conversations all of the time with people. Why are my children struggling with this? Well, let's look at you first. Why does sin seem to run in families? Why does it get perpetuated down through the generations? Because somebody along the line was unwilling to say, this is enough, and turn away from that sin and get right with the Lord. Generational sin is real, and it persists down through the generations. And then fourthly and finally, only by the grace of another can we be saved from ourselves. Notice verse 29. So it was that when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had lived. So why was Lot delivered? On the account of Abraham. Lot may have been a believer, but it was grace shown because of Abraham that saved him. The text tells us explicitly. And we too have been delivered, not on account of Abraham, but on account of Christ. Judgment is coming to the world in which you and I live as well. We too live in a world that is full of sin. We might ask the question, what is our sin today? What is the sin of the culture and the world in which you and I live? Is it pride, prejudice, homosexuality, rape, incest, violence, murder, and on and on and on? Do you think this world is ripe for judgment? As do I. One day it's going to come. But because of Christ, we can be delivered from it. Just as Lot was spared because he knew the Lord, we can be spared from the judgment that is to come because of the Lord. For those of us who have trusted Christ, God won't count our sins against us, not because of us, but because of grace shown toward Christ, who sacrificed himself for us. It is because of him that we will be delivered, not because of us. My question is, are you ready to trust him today? Let's pray.